very foundation of faith. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "The best of you are those who are best to their wives." That statement alone should make any believer pause before claiming religious justification for emotional neglect. Believer must constantly examine their intention. Is this act driven by compassion or by ego, by faith or by desire? Because on the day of judgment, Allah will not ask how many rights you claimed, but how many hearts you protected. He will not measure fairness by contracts, but by sincerity. True justice begins in the heart, and without it, even lawful actions become a source of harm. So, the real question is not whether polygamy is fair, because in divine law, fairness is already built in. The question is whether we are fair enough to practice it as Allah intended. The issue lies not in the permission, but in the human condition. The more we distance ourselves from humility, empathy, and God consciousness, the more we misuse what was revealed to uplift us. Islam is not a religion of rigid rules, but of righteous balance, and polygamy, when understood in its sacred context, reflects that balance. It is neither a symbol of male superiority nor female inferiority. It is a testament to divine wisdom that sees what human limitation cannot. But that wisdom is only seen by those whose hearts are sincere. In the end, what defines a believer is not how many privileges, but how responsibly they use them. True strength in Islam is not in claiming rights, it is in fulfilling them. And true justice is not found in multiple marriages, but in one heart that chooses righteousness over desire. Polygamy in Islam has often been portrayed through a distorted lens, misunderstood by some and misused by others. Yet at its core, it is a law rooted in wisdom, balance, and justice. When we peel away the cultural layers and emotional assumptions that surround it, we find that the allowance of polygamy in Islam was never a symbol of male privilege, but rather a reflection of divine compassion and social responsibility. Islam did not introduce polygamy. It existed long before revelation, often in forms of exploitation where men would marry countless women without limit, neglecting their rights and dignity. What Islam did was reform this chaotic practice and bring justice into a system that had none. The Qur'an limited the number of wives to 4, but it placed that restriction alongside a heavy condition, the command to be completely fair and just. And this is not a light condition. Allah said in the Qur'an, "Marry women of your choice, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear you cannot be just, then only one." In this verse lies the heart of divine justice, because Allah, the creator of hearts, knows how difficult it is for human beings to balance emotions, resources, and responsibilities equally. This verse does not promote polygamy as a goal to pursue. It presents it as an exception allowed only when fairness can be upheld. If there is even a doubt of injustice, Allah commands that monogamy is better. This means Islam's true intention was to regulate human behavior, not to encourage desire. The permission came not from indulgence, but from mercy to address real human and social needs. For example, in times of war, when many men were lost and women were left widowed or alone with children, this system provided protection and stability. It was never meant to exploit women, but to ensure that no woman would be left vulnerable or dishonored in society. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, lived this teaching with perfect balance and compassion. He showed that polygamy is not an act of pleasure but of purpose. Each of his marriages carried a wisdom, some for alliance, some for social protection, and some for teaching the community compassion and inclusion. Never was his practice motivated by selfishness or neglect. He was known for his fairness among his wives, dividing his time and provision equally. Yet even he would raise his hands and pray, "O Allah, this is my division in what I can control. So do not blame me for what you control and I cannot." This prayer shows the humility and awareness required for such a responsibility. It acknowledges that even the most just and kind person cannot fully control their emotions. Love may lead toward one heart, and that is why the Prophet asked for Allah's mercy in what lies beyond human capacity. This example makes it clear that polygamy in Islam is not a free pass, it's a heavy trust. It requires spiritual maturity, emotional discipline, and selflessness, qualities that are rare in an age where relationships are often built on ego and instant gratification. The misuse of this law occurs when people read the verse as a privilege rather than a test. Many claim the right to marry more than one wife without understanding the divine weight of justice that comes with it. When that happens, what was once meant to protect women becomes the very thing that hurts them. And the pain that results from that misuse is not the fault of Islam, but the failure of the heart to live by its moral essence. In truth, polygamy is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Islam because people try to separate it from its spiritual foundation. They see it only as a social arrangement rather than a spiritual responsibility. Every command in Islam, even those that deal with human relationships, is deeply tied to the purification of the heart. Allah's laws are not arbitrary rules. They are pathways to spiritual growth. The permission of polygamy was revealed in a specific social context, but its underlying principle, justice, is universal. Justice in Islam is not simply about dividing time or wealth equally. It's about emotional integrity, compassion, and sincerity of intention. If a man cannot maintain emotional and moral fairness, then his outward justice becomes meaningless. The Prophet taught that the best of you are those who are best to their wives. That hadith alone refutes every misuse of this law, because it places kindness and character above authority or desire. A believer cannot claim righteousness while causing harm to another's heart. Polygamy, therefore, is not for the emotionally immature or the spiritually negligent. It is for those whose hearts are anchored in taqwa, God consciousness, and who understand that every relationship is a trust from Allah that must be guarded with mercy. In our modern world, where emotions are fragile and commitment is often shallow, the concept of polygamy challenges believers to reflect on what true justice and faithfulness mean. It is not about how many you can love, but about how sincerely you can fulfill the rights of one heart without harming another. Islam gives permission, but attaches it to accountability, and accountability before Allah is the most serious of all. When people misuse this permission, turning it into a source of oppression, they are not practicing Islam, they are betraying it. The goal of Islamic law is always to protect, to elevate, to preserve harmony. Polygamy, when practiced within its divine limits, can be an act of mercy and social balance. But when stripped of its ethics, it becomes cruelty. This is why Allah warns, you will never be able to be completely just between wives, even if you strive. This verse is a reminder that human justice has limits, and that humility must accompany any action done in Allah's name. Therefore, true believers approach this not with arrogance, but with fear of accountability. They know that love is not ownership, and leadership in a marriage is not domination, but service. The real man is not the one who collects hearts, but the one who protects them. The real believer is not the one who claims his rights loudly, but the one who fulfills them quietly with sincerity. So, when we talk about polygamy in Islam, we must remember, it is not about the number of partners one has, it is about the number of hearts one can be fair to in the sight of Allah. And fairness is not measured by the world's applause, by the peace of conscience that comes when a soul knows it has done what is right before its creator. The concept of polygamy in Islam, when explored through the lens of divine wisdom rather than distortion, reveals an incredible depth of compassion, justice, and social balance that the modern world often overlooks. Islam polygamy, it regulated an existing practice that was once rampant, unfair, and often oppressive. Before revelation, men could marry as many women as they pleased without limits or concern for their well-being. Women were frequently treated as possessions, left without rights, inheritance, or dignity. When Islam came, it set boundaries that transformed marriage into a sacred contract built on love, respect, and responsibility. The permission to marry more than one wife was not a command or a privilege for indulgence, but a regulated mercy meant to address specific social and humanitarian needs. At the time of the Prophet, wars left many widows and orphaned children vulnerable, and this system offered them protection, not pity. It ensured that no woman was left without support or security. But even then, the permission was tied to one condition: justice. The Quran states, marry women of your choice 2, 3, or 4, but if you fear that you cannot be just then only one. This verse places justice as the foundation. Justice here is not just about wealth or material fairness, but about emotional and spiritual equity, about maintaining balance, compassion, and consistency in treatment. It reminds us that marriage in Islam is not about personal gain, it is about service, responsibility, and accountability before Allah. Every law in Islam carries both an external and internal dimension, the external being the social order it maintains, and the internal being the purification it nurtures in the heart. Polygamy, too, is a spiritual test, not a trophy. It tests sincerity, patience, emotional maturity, and the ability to prioritize the will of Allah over personal pleasure. However, the beauty of this law has often been clouded by misuse, misunderstanding, and misrepresentation, the problem lies not in the law itself, but in how people approach it without the spiritual consciousness that it demands. In today's world, where the ego dominates and moral responsibility weakens, polygamy is often used as a means of fulfilling desire rather than upholding justice. Some men claim this right without understanding that it is not a right to take, it is a trust to bear. When the purpose of a law is misunderstood, its application becomes corrupt, and when it becomes corrupt, people blame the religion instead of the human negligence that distorts it. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, practiced polygamy, but his life was defined by compassion, humility, and fairness. Each of his marriages carried a specific wisdom. Some were to care for widows, others to strengthen social bonds, and some to spread the message of Islam through family ties. Never once was it about selfish pleasure. His example shows that the allowance of polygamy in Islam is a call to responsibility, not indulgence. The Prophet divided his time, wealth, and care equally among his wives, yet even he would pray, "O Allah, this is my division in what I can control, so do not blame me for what you control and I do not." This humility reveals the spiritual depth of this matter. It acknowledges that justice, though commanded, has limits when it comes to emotions, and only Allah is perfectly just. Thus, believer who contemplates polygamy must first evaluate his heart. Is it ruled by self-interest or submission? Because in Islam, every relationship is an act of worship when done for Allah's sake, and an act of injustice when driven by ego. The verse that allows polygamy also warns against emotional imbalance. You will never be able to be completely just between wives, even if you strive. This warning should humble the heart, reminding us that what is permissible is not always easy, and what is lawful can still become sinful if done without taqwa, God consciousness. The essence of Islam is mercy, and every divine command serves to protect that mercy within society. When polygamy is practiced as Allah intended, it preserves families, safeguards women's dignity, and upholds fairness. But when practiced through pride, deception, or selfishness, it causes pain and chaos, and that is not Islam's fault. It is the fault of the human heart that forgot Allah's command to be just. The Prophet said, "The best of you are those who are best to their wives," which reminds us that kindness, not authority, defines true leadership in Islam. Polygamy is not about collecting wives, it is about carrying a heavier load of responsibility with humility. It is about creating harmony, not competition. A true believer understands that the allowance of polygamy is a divine concession, not a divine preference. It was permitted to solve social crises, not to satisfy emotional restlessness. And even in its permission, Allah made justice the condition, knowing that justice is the rarest quality in human hearts. In truth, monogamy remains the general norm, while polygamy exists as an exception that only a few can manage with righteousness. If one cannot be just, then one is commanded to be content with one. This shows that Islam values fairness over form, compassion over quantity, and sincerity over status. At its deepest level, this topic calls for introspection more than argument. It asks the believer to look beyond the external practice and examine the inner intention. Are you using religion to justify desires or using faith to discipline them? Because Islam is not a religion of convenience. It is a religion of conscience. Every verse, every rule, every permission carries a mirror for the soul. The allowance of polygamy reflects Allah's mercy, his awareness of human weakness and social need, but it also reflects his demand for moral excellence. The misuse of this permission in our time has created emotional wounds and distrust, but the cure lies in returning to the sincerity that Islam teaches. For a believer who understands this law through the lens of the Quran, polygamy becomes less about having more and more about being more patient, more selfless, more conscious of Allah. In the end, what defines a believer is not how many rights he claims, but how gently he fulfills the rights of others. Justice is not a claim, it is a state of the heart, and the heart that cannot be just in love cannot be just in life. The true purpose of Islam's law is not to create privilege, but to produce purity. And purity begins when the heart learns to love as Allah commands, not as the ego desires. The topic of polygamy in Islam, when explored with sincerity and depth, reveals not a story of oppression, but a narrative of divine mercy intertwined with human accountability. To truly understand it, one must detach from cultural misinterpretations and ego-driven justifications, and instead approach it as a principle rooted in justice and compassion. The Quran did not introduce polygamy as an encouragement for men to satisfy personal desire. Rather, it came to place boundaries upon an already existing practice, guiding it toward moral order and fairness. Before the message of Islam, polygamy was widespread and uncontrolled. Men could marry as many women as they wished, often discarding them without responsibility or care. Islam came as a reform, not an endorsement. It did not say, marry as you please, but instead said, marry women of your choice, 2, 3, or 4, but if you fear you cannot be just, then only one. This single verse transformed a chaotic social custom into a system of ethics built on balance, equity, and mercy. The condition of justice embedded in this verse is not just a passing word, it is the foundation upon which the entire permission stands. It signifies that polygamy is not a privilege, but a test. It is not a celebration of male power, but a reminder of divine accountability. And justice in Islam is far deeper than equal wealth or time. It includes fairness of emotion, consistency of treatment, and the spiritual awareness that every heart entrusted to one's care is a trust from Allah. This makes polygamy one of the most spiritually demanding responsibilities, one that only a person of taqwa or deep God consciousness can handle sincerely. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, demonstrated through his life that this permission was not a means of indulgence, but a tool of compassion. His multiple marriages were rooted in social, emotional, and spiritual reasons, each carrying a wisdom that benefited the community. He married widows, women of different tribes, and those in need of protection or alliance, establishing unity and compassion in a society fragmented by war and tribalism. His example reveals that polygamy, when practiced with integrity, serves as a form of mercy, uplifting women rather than exploiting them. Yet even the Prophet, whose character was flawless, would raise his hands and say, "O Allah, this is my division in what I can control, so do not blame me for what you control and I cannot." His humility shows that even in perfect justice of action, emotional fairness remains beyond human perfection. How then can someone in our time, with all the imperfections of ego and emotion, claim to fulfill justice easily? This acknowledgement from the Prophet himself teaches that polygamy is not for those seeking comfort or dominance, but for those strong enough to face the weight of fairness. The command of justice was given as a guardrail to protect the vulnerable, to restrain the powerful, and to remind every believer that rights in Islam are never free of responsibilities. Sadly, what was revealed as mercy has often been twisted into a weapon of injustice. Many men today invoke this law without comprehending its moral weight, treating polygamy as an entitlement instead of an amanah, a sacred trust. And when that happens, the harm that follows is not the fault of Islam, but of those who have disconnected the law from its spirit. The law was never the problem. The problem lies in the hearts that misuse it for ego while ignoring its essence of equality and compassion. In truth, polygamy in Islam is a reflection of divine flexibility, an allowance designed to address real social and emotional needs within specific contexts. It is neither an obligation nor an encouragement. It exists to protect, not to exploit, to balance, not to destabilize. Allah knew that societies would face different circumstances, war, widows, orphans, and social imbalances, and in such times, this system could serve as a mercy. The same Quran that permits it also warns that you will never be able to be completely just between wives, even if you strive. This verse humbles the heart and recenters the believer's focus on responsibility rather than privilege. It is a reminder that even lawful actions can become sinful if driven by arrogance or selfishness. The beauty of Islam lies in this balance. It gives permission where needed, but attaches it to conscience and moral restraint. True faith is never about how much one is allowed to do, but how well one fulfills the moral weight of that allowance. The Prophet said, "The best of you are those who are best to their wives." Establishing that excellence in character, not authority, defines true leadership. A man's greatness in Islam is measured not by how many wives he has, but by how justly he treats the one heart Allah has placed in his care. Justice is the essence of faith, and where it is absent, no law, no matter how divine, can be rightly applied. In the modern era, where emotional immaturity and self-centeredness have clouded human relationships, the concept of polygamy challenges believers to look inward. It forces the question, am I seeking to serve Allah or myself? Islam's laws are not meant to satisfy human desire, but to purify it. The permission of polygamy, when applied in its correct spirit, can preserve families, protect women, and uphold community welfare. But when detached from justice, it becomes a cause of pain, and resentment in Islam came to prevent. The distinction between fair practice and misuse lies in the heart of the believer. One who practices polygamy with compassion, fairness, and sincerity walks the path of responsibility. One who does so through ego or deceit violates the spirit of Islam, the religion that commands, "Do not harm one another." can never approve of a practice that causes emotional destruction. The goal of Islam's guidance is always purification of society and of the soul. Every law, whether concerning wealth, power, or marriage, exists to refine the heart. And in the case of polygamy, the test of justice becomes the mirror of one's faith. The true believer does not use the Quran to justify his desires, but uses it to discipline them. In the end, polygamy is not about how many one can love.